January 20th, 1981 was Jimmy Carter's last day in office.
Mr. President, the hostage is out.
Can't say yet.
Not yet, Sam. Not yet.
For the past 444 days, he had struggled and failed to free American hostages held in Iran.
Thank you. Thank you. Senator Hatfield, Mr. Chief Justice, Mr. President.
Then, only minutes after Ronald Reagan began his inaugural address, the hostage ordeal finally came to an end. At the time of the hostage release, most Americans were simply relieved the ordeal was over. But a few people wondered about the extraordinary coincidence.
When the hostages were released just 30 minutes after Ronald Reagan became president, the timing seemed peculiar.
Gary Sick was a naval officer and Middle East expert assigned to Jimmy Carter's National Security Council staff. He was the White House point man on the hostage crisis.
We had reports later on that the people holding the hostages, in fact, were standing with watches waiting at the airport to make sure that the time had passed, that Carter was no longer president, before releasing the hostages. That could have been explained simply on the grounds that they detested Jimmy Carter and that this was just one more turn of the knife. But it did strike many, many people as peculiar, the timing of the thing and the way the Iranians worked it out. And a lot of people suspected right then that some kind of a deal had been done.
Was there a deal? Did the Reagan campaign tamper with the hostages' fate? Secret meetings in Europe, the Middle East, and Washington have been alleged, but definitive evidence remains elusive. For 6 months, Frontline investigated the allegations. In tonight's report, an examination of the mysteries surrounding the hostages' release. When the hostages were seized in November of 1979, the Carter White House was stunned. The president moved quickly to punish Iran, freezing Iranian assets, branding Iran a terrorist state, and halting all arms deliveries. He hoped that these actions would force a quick resolution to the crisis. Judy Powell was President Carter's press secretary.
The point of doing it was, if, when you release the hostages, then we can consider releasing your funds, releasing your arms that have already been paid for, and that sort of thing. So that was clearly sitting there, and indeed that's the reason you take the step of imposing an embargo, is that it is a stick while it lasts, and it's a carrot if the other side does what you want them to do in the end.
In fact, I think that our strategy on that, though it didn't work, wasn't bad in the sense that there are very few countries in the world that would have taken the kind of beating that Iran took between November of '79 and January of 1981 to make a political point. But Iran was a revolutionary society, and revolutionary societies are slightly crazy. And Iran was slightly crazy at that time.
Through the first few months of the hostage crisis, the nation rallied round the president. But as efforts to resolve the situation peacefully floundered, President Carter made a fateful judgment.
It was my decision to attempt the rescue operation. It was my decision to cancel it when problems developed in the placement of our rescue team for a future rescue operation. The responsibility is fully my own. In the aftermath of the attempt, we continue to hold the government of Iran responsible for the safety and for the early release of the American hostages who have been held so long.
The fiasco in the desert bolstered the Republicans' complaint that the country had grown weak under Jimmy Carter. The failure of the mission and the death of 8 American servicemen played into the hands of the Reagan campaign, now under the direction of William Casey.
When Governor Reagan asked me to undertake the management of his campaign, I accepted enthusiastically.
William Casey had served in World War II as a spy master with the OSS, the CIA's forerunner, and would later run the CIA for the first 6 years of the Reagan administration.
I feel very strongly that this country is in trouble, that it needs to be turned around, and I have felt for over a year that Governor Reagan is the only man in America who's ever turned the government around.
Disdain for Jimmy Carter was shared by many conservatives in Europe and Israel. In early July, Casey traveled to London and Paris to enlist the support of European politicians. Albert Jolis, along on the trip, had served with Casey in the OSS.
You know, he was over there on a 3-day visit, and it was all compressed into a highly concentrated 3 days. There wasn't much sleeping going on, and he said, I got to see Mirange, and he went off and saw Mirange. I don't know where he saw him.
Count Alexandre de Mirange was the chief of French intelligence, another staunch anti-communist. Mirange declined to be interviewed, but his name would surface later in claims that French intelligence helped Casey delay the hostage release. The meeting with Mirange fit Casey's pattern of erratic disappearances that became legendary within the campaign.
I must say, Bill Casey to me was sort of a mystery man. You know, he was here, he was there, he was around.
Retired Admiral Robert Garrick was an aide at Reagan campaign headquarters where Casey had his office.
He had his own driver, and the car would whip away, and the driver brought him to these meetings when he showed up. The way he deported himself, you never knew exactly what he knew, but you sometimes felt he knew something, and he'd tell you at the appropriate time.
You know, there's been a lot of propaganda about Bill Casey. People haven't liked him because of his policies. And because of that, they have sought to picture him as a corner cutter and a fellow who would maybe not be too fussy about the ethics of the issue and things like that. That's just sour grapes, as far as I'm concerned. It just wasn't so. He was an honorable man and highly honorable, ethical, principled. But getting things done meant either getting around the red tape or cutting through it or ignoring it. But he couldn't stand the red tape.
While Casey was meeting in Europe, another development was taking place in the Middle East, a development that was alarming America's ally, Israel.
But suddenly information starts coming in that the Iraqis are preparing for war against Iran. They want to take over Khuzestan, the oil-rich southern province of Iran.
Ari Ben-Menashe was an Israeli intelligence officer attached to the Israeli Defense Forces.
We start seeing hard intelligence that the Iraqis were preparing for war. And the Israelis were extremely worried about that. They did not want, in no way, the Iraqis to be an overwhelming power in the Middle East.
By early 1980, Israel's Prime Minister Menachem Begin was hearing Iranian appeals for military equipment.
Their biggest worry was the Air Force. They had no tires. Their F-4s had flat tires. They were not in good condition. They were looking for spare parts, tires, and wheelbases. These were their first inquiries. And we sold them the tires.
The tire sale did not please President Carter.